let me then sort of update you a little bit in terms of what has happened since last. I think I have to take you back to, which for me feels like a very long time ago, early December. I think up until that point in time, I think I've told you many times now that, basically since end of June, when we were trying to do the first pilot transfer, we then sort of changed a little bit tack in order to prepare ourselves for more or less taking on the assets of 3 banks at the same time. And the concept we had was basically to make the legal transfers, I take on the legal title of all the assets in a number of sequential tranches. And sort of take that out over time in order to make sure that we have, I would say, a perfect handover from the banks to us. When we got into December and when the consequences of the AQR and the stress tests started to become sort of clear, we were in the situation, and in the discussions with Bank of Slovenia and Minister of Finance, we found ourselves in a situation where in order to actually save the systemic banks here, we had to change concept, and that sort of decision was taken on December 6th. And that change of concept actually meant that we have to basically make sure that by year end we could help clean out the balance sheets of NLB and NKBM in a way where all the assets, or I would say almost all of the assets from those 2 banks, came into the legal possession of BMC, so out of the books of the 2 banks and onto our books. And that was basically, I would say, the precondition in order for the government to recapitalize the banks. So the banks went into this year with a balance sheet that complied to, the banking rules, the Basel rules in terms of the equity, the capital requirements, and also that they then had basically a balance sheet which they, going into this year, can use to make sure that we can start funding the economy again. So it was actually a bit of a change of concept at the very last minute in order to actually make this happen. Sorry, I'm just going to drink it. Now, you can always find a solution to a situation like that, because you can find a legal way to actually assume the ownership of the assets, but actually I would say the practical steps of actually making the transfers in an orderly way and making sure that we don't sort of destroy value in the asset transfer, that still have to hold. So what we set up was basically a contract catalog with each bank, where there are basically 3 components. One is actually the contract where we define actually what assets to be acquired. And just to remind you there, those assets have been specified actually not by us at all. We haven't had no insight into actually how the selection of the asset has been made. We have certainly sort of given our principle of how it should be made, but we actually don't know what's in the banks. We only know what we have been instructed to basically buy. And the asset transfer prices are in the end set by, ultimately by DG Comp, who had to approve those. So basically we've been executing in terms of the scope and the prices on those instructions, as I think we told you before, so that's no news to that. But that first contract basically specified what assets we're going to buy and how that's sort of legally going to happen. We needed 2 more things based on this new concept. We needed to make sure that over a time period when we transfer managerial control, that we are provided certain services from the bank. So we set up basically a service, what we call SLA catalog, service level agreements for services that we need. And that was prepared from the beginning. But the twist here was that since we assumed legal responsibility, i.e. all the risks and rewards according to those assets, and we still didn't have, I would say, the documentation for actually take on and act effectively on that, we also had to set up a contract with the banks where they, during a transition period, which is going to be up until end of April, act as our asset managers, i.e. we will actually buy their recommendations for how to take decisions, not the decisions actually, but the recommendation from them, and make sure that they act as our case managers in a sense during this transition period until we have the appropriate documentation so we can effectively take on full managerial control. And that is a little bit tricky thing to do, so we had a lot of work actually to do during those intensive 2 weeks basically. But I would say that there are actually quite a few unsung heroes who spent up until very early mornings making sure that the contract got in place. Certainly in this organization, but I also would say that in the banks, in the two banks, and also at Bank of Slovenia and Ministry of Finance. So in a way, I'm actually quite impressed by what the key stakeholders actually were able to do, given a very short time frame up until basically we signed and closed the deal on December 20th. The actual asset management, the sales and purchase agreement, if I call it that, was signed on December 18th, and the other contracts were sort of condition precedents to sort of the full transaction. The last contract was signed on December 20th, I believe, at 11:30 in the morning or something like that, and we then executed the payment, i.e. we had issued the bond and we paid the banks with that bond later that day, so the whole deal was closed on December 20th. We also recently got sort of, I would say, a very important sort of acknowledgement from ECB, and that is that the bond is qualifying for being collateral in the euro system, which means that the banks can use that payment to go out and basically go to ECB and basically take that bond and get liquidity for that, which can be used to basically give out new financing for good businesses in Slovenia going forward. So that's a very critical step. So we actually managed to remedy a very serious situation. I think everybody feels that it's been sort of status quo and nothing really has happened. But actually we were in this very serious situation where we had failed banks and they were rescued just before year end. And we're coming into this year with banks that can actually function. So, I think it's worth sort of making sure that we sort of set that story also, since that also implies a little bit what we're going to do going forward. As I said, we are still planning to make the physical transfers of the assets in tranches. So that concept still holds, and we are in that process right now. Actually, the team is out in the banks right now, sitting down with the case managers, reviewing the actual documentation. We have digital copies of that now, so we're ensuring that we get the appropriate documentation and the complete files as they are over to us, so we can take ownership and managerial control of cases that we're now sort of getting in. But remind me, this is a process which is actually going to take up until end of April, as we look at it. So that's a bit what we have been doing up until now. Of course, when we start talking about priorities, one of the biggest ones that we have going forward is to make sure that we now grow this organization even further in order to make sure that we can continue to take good quality decisions and so on. And that is a challenge, and that is actually one of the first major roles that Chris will take on, and make sure that we, I would say, convert this organization, which is sort of 20 people right now, and more sort of formed to be very flexible and able to adapt to quick changes, which I think we've proven that we could do, but to sort of transform that into a bigger organization that has also more the features of a high quality, sort of more stable organization. So with that little introduction, I actually leave the word to Chris.